imagine sitting down at like a really high stakes poker table. You bet your life savings, the cards are dealt, and you look down to see a royal flush.
Right, the perfect hand.
Exactly. You lay your cards on the table, and you expect to collect your winnings based on the objective, universally understood rules of the game.
Sure.
But then the dealer looks at you, kind of shakes his head, and announces that the definition of a flush was actually changed like 5 minutes ago by some committee you've never even met.
Wow.
Yeah, so your hand is now worthless.
Yeah.
I mean, you haven't just lost the game. The very reality of the game was retroactively rewritten to ensure your defeat.
That is a brutal analogy, but it's incredibly accurate.
Right. And according to a highly provocative new book, this isn't just some poker analogy. This is the exact form of linguistic warfare that is currently dismantling modern institutions and, well, specifically, penalizing competent men.
Yeah, it's a profound disruption of how we negotiate reality.
Uh-huh.
I mean, when the foundational definitions of words shift right beneath our feet, the entire superstructure of society, law, commerce, relationships, it all begins to work.
Which is wild to think about. So welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today we are undertaking a comprehensive, ultra-long review and breakdown of a fiercely debated new ebook. It's titled Microaggression Myths: Surviving Feminist Linguistic Attacks by Conrad Riker.
It is a dense one for sure.
It really is. We're going to deconstruct the architecture of this text. And for those of you listening who want to follow along or grab a copy to study the source material yourselves, you should absolutely check out Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books.
Highly recommend getting the source material.
Definitely. Also, right out of the gate, we want to ask you to please like and subscribe to the show. Your support genuinely helps us grow and allows us to keep bringing you these incredibly detailed, long-form breakdowns.
Now, before we move an inch further, we really need to establish the ground rules for the journey we are taking you on today.
Yes, the crucial caveat.
Right. This text contains intensely politically charged material. It is vital to make absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are acting strictly as impartial expert guides. Our role is not to endorse or condemn the viewpoints of Conrad Riker or the political left, the right, feminists, Marxists, anyone.
Yeah, our job is just to ruthlessly dissect the arguments and the historical timelines presented in this book so you can fully comprehend the author's worldview.
Exactly. We want you to understand the mechanics of his claims.
And we're tailoring this specific deep dive for listeners who are already, highly engaged with the men's rights space, the manosphere, and those of you seeking to understand the red-pilled perspective on modern cultural dynamics.
You guys already know the baseline concepts.
Right? So today we're looking at how Riker applies them to explain the systematic capture of Western institutions. We'll trace the historical blueprint of this capture, break down a really fascinating economic concept he calls grievance arbitrage, and finally explore his ultimate survival strategy, which he calls fortress masculinity.
So, getting right into it, the foundational premise Riker establishes early in the text is that modern men are the targets of, quote, linguistic terrorism.
Linguistic terrorism, yeah.
Executed through what he calls a dictionary attack. He entirely rejects the mainstream narrative that language is simply evolving organically to become, more inclusive.
Right, he doesn't buy that at all.
Now, for a second. Instead, he frames this shift, the radical redefinition of words like violence, oppression, gender, and equity, as a deliberate, calculated psychological operation.
And when I was reading his breakdown of this dictionary attack, I found it just fascinating that he traces the blueprint not to some recent internet forum, but all the way back to the academic faculty lounges of 1967.
Oh yeah, he points the finger directly at the French intellectual Jacques Derrida.
The deconstructionism guy.
Exactly, the birth of deconstructionism. Riker focuses heavily on Derrida's concept of difference. And, well, without turning this into a massive, dense seminar on postmodernism, Derrida essentially proposed that words do not have stable, inherent meanings.
Wait, so, no word actually means what it means?
Right. According to Derrida, a word only has meaning in its difference from other words, and therefore, true meaning is perpetually deferred. It's never fixed.
Wow.
And Riker argues that Derrida intentionally utilized incredibly opaque, impenetrable jargon to basically paralyze the academic establishment.
It essentially makes the obvious seem hopelessly complicated, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you can convince the intelligentsia that no word has a truly stable definition, then you've effectively dissolved objective reality.
That's the goal.
Because under that framework, All categories, especially hard biological categories like sex, they can be casually dismissed as mere social constructs designed by those in power.
And that leads directly to the second architect Riker identifies, which is Michel Foucault.
Okay, what did Foucault add to the mix?
Well, Riker brings in Foucault's lectures from the 1970s, which famously argued that knowledge and power are inextricably linked. Meaning there is no objective truth, only regimes of truth created by the dominant class.
Oh, okay, I see where this is going.
Right. So, according to Riker's analysis, merging Derrida's unstable language with Foucault's power dynamics gave left-wing academics the ultimate philosophical weapon. It provided them with the perfect excuse to completely ignore empirical evidence, statistical realities, and, biological facts.
Because if a guy walks into a boardroom or a classroom and presents objective, hard data, say, regarding biological differences or meritocratic outcomes, well, under Foucault's framework, that data isn't debated on its logical merits, is it?
Not at all.
The very act of presenting objective data is pathologized as a manifestation of patriarchal dominance. Like, the content of the argument is totally ignored, and the identity of the speaker becomes the sole focus of the attack.
Exactly. And Riker argues this is a deliberate Marxist strategy.
How so?
Well, traditional Marxism relied on economic class warfare, right? But that largely failed to take root in the prosperous West. So, according to Riker, the strategy shifted from material economics to cultural linguistics.
Okay.
Activists essentially weaponized a bastardized version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Right, and for those familiar with linguistics, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the idea that the language you speak strictly determines the thoughts you are capable of having.
Yes.
But actual cognitive scientists abandoned the strong version of that theory, like decades ago.
Yeah.
We know language influences thought, but it doesn't imprison it in a deterministic box.
True, but Riker argues that the progressive establishment treats this outdated theory as unquestionable gospel. Their operating logic is basically change the dictionary and you literally change human cognition.
Which explains so much.
Right. That is the fundamental reason behind the severe, almost tyrannical policing of vocabulary and pronouns we see today. It is an attempt to rewrite human biology and historical reality by brute forcing a new vocabulary into existence.
But here is the bridge Riker has to cross for me. How does an esoteric 1960s French philosophy actually breach the walls of modern corporate America?
That's a fair question.
Like, how does it impact a guy who's just trying to clock in, do his job, and provide for his family? I mean, most regular people have never read Foucault.
No, they haven't. Riker explains the transmission mechanism through a tactic he calls linguistic entryism.
Linguistic entryism.
Yeah. This is the deliberate tactical insertion of redefined terms into mainstream institutional discourse. The goal is to aggressively shift the Overton window, the range of acceptable political discourse, before any organic opposition can even recognize what is happening.
So when I was looking at his examples of this entryism, the evolution of the term microaggression really stood out as the perfect case study.
Ooh, it's his primary example.
Yeah. Riker maps this out brilliantly. He notes that the term was originally coined in 1970 by a Harvard psychiatrist named Chester M. Pierce. But back in 1970, Pierce used it to describe very specific, blatant, and observable racial insults, specifically in television programming.
Right, it had a concrete, observable definition. It required an action and an intent.
Exactly. But then Riker points to 2007, when Gerald Wing Su and his colleagues drastically expanded the framework. They mutated the concept so vastly that it suddenly encompassed literally any behavior, however innocuous, that made a member of a designated minority or victim class feel vaguely uncomfortable.
And that mutation is the key to linguistic entryism. The term retained the severe moral weight of its original 1970s definition, but its parameters were expanded to infinity.
It completely bypassed the intent of the accused.
Yes, the objective reality of what was said no longer mattered. The entire interaction was judged solely by the subjective, unprovable feeling of the accuser.
Riker highlights a truly astonishing example of this in practice, which just blew my mind. He points to the University of California system. In 2014, they officially published guidelines listing the phrase, "America is the land of opportunity," as a formal microaggression.
Let's analyze the mechanics of that specific example because it's wild.
Please do.
Riker argues that by declaring a statement of historical optimism and ambition to be a recognizable offense, the institution becomes a theater of the absurd. I mean, the phrase, land of opportunity, implies that meritocracy exists.
Right.
And for an ideology built on the premise of inescapable systemic oppression, the very concept of meritocracy is an existential threat. Therefore, the phrase must be outlawed not because it is harmful, but because it contradicts the new regime of truth.
He compares these newly expanded terms to Arthur Koestler's concept of stop words from his 1949 book, The God That Failed.
Yes, great connection there.
Koestler described how totalitarian systems invent specific vocabulary designed to literally halt critical thought. Riker argues that terms like microaggression or toxic masculinity or check your privilege, they function as linguistic trapdoors. They are thought-terminating cliches.
And the moment someone levels one of these accusations at you, the rational conversation instantly terminates. No empirical evidence is required. No malicious intent needs to be proven. The accusation itself operates as the conviction.
And the true malice of these stop words lies in what happens if you attempt to defend yourself.
The Kafka trap.
Yes. Riker points out the Kafkaesque nature of the trap. If you are accused of a microaggression and you deny it, your denial is inherently treated as proof of your profound ignorance and guilt.
It's brilliant in a terrifying way.
It is the linguistic equivalent of a 17th century witch trial. If you deny you are a witch, the inquisitor simply smiles and says, well, that is exactly what a witch would say.
Right, because you are playing a game where the rules of material reality have been totally suspended. So we really must look at the specific psychological damage this linguistic architecture inflicts on the individual.
Right, the real-world impact.
Exactly. And this transition brings us to one of Riker's most controversial arguments in the book, his deconstruction of the phrase toxic masculinity, which he entirely rejects as a legitimate psychological framework. Instead, he categorizes it as a misandrist double bind.
So for the listeners, a double bind is a psychological dilemma where an individual receives two conflicting messages, and no matter how they respond, they are punished.
You're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right. And Riker maps this onto the modern man's experience perfectly. On one hand, if a man behaves in alignment with traditional masculine virtues, if he's stoic, highly competitive, dominant, and protective, the woke dictionary immediately pathologizes him.
Immediately.
He is labeled a predator, an oppressor, a relic of a toxic patriarchy that desperately needs to be dismantled.
He is penalized for exercising natural authority. The system demands that he suppress those innate drives and replace them with emotional vulnerability, softness, and this endless introspection.
And here's the actual jaws of the trap. If a man actually complies with those progressive demands, if he lays down his armor, suppresses his competitive drive, and opens up emotionally, Riker argues he is utterly despised.
Yep.
The very same institutions, media figures, and women who demanded his vulnerability will look at him with deep, visceral disgust because he now lacks the very masculine strength they just shamed him for possessing.
He is attacked for being a man, and he is reviled for failing to be one.
Wow.
Riker argues this paradox is not some clumsy accident of a change in culture. He says it is a meticulously rigged game designed to extract compliance, induce chronic self-doubt, and ultimately break a man's spirit.
And he links this to an interesting psychological concept he terms animus possession.
Yes, he's drawing lightly on Jungian concepts here, but adapting them to his political theory.
The animus being the masculine aspect within the female psyche.
Exactly. The animus is the unconscious masculine aspect within the female psyche. Riker claims that modern intersectional feminism has essentially weaponized a recognized mental disturbance, like a deep-seated pathological hostility toward men and masculine energy, and successfully repackaged it as a legitimate mainstream political ideology.
Now, let me play devil's advocate for a second. If we look at the mainstream narrative right now, everywhere you look, from corporate HR messaging to mainstream therapy, culture, society, constantly insists that emotional vulnerability is a man's greatest strength.
It's everywhere.
The prevailing wisdom is that women want men who cry, men who are completely open about their insecurities. And Riker's essentially looking at the listener and saying, that is a trapdoor, do not step on it. How does he justify making a claim that so aggressively contradicts the modern consensus?
Well, he justifies it by appealing to hard evolutionary psychology and cross-cultural empirical data. Riker argues that biological reality completely overrides the progressive linguistic narrative.
What kind of data?
He cites David Buss's landmark 1989 cross-cultural study on human mate preferences, Buss studied 37 different societies across 6 continents. I mean, we're talking vastly different cultures, religions, and political systems.
And findings were universal.
Completely universal. Buss proved that across all human societies, women are biologically and sexually attracted to dominant, stoic, high-status males who demonstrate the capacity to acquire resources and protect.
So it's not a social construct.
No, Riker says it is an evolutionary hardwiring that cannot be socialized away in a few decades.
So Riker's premise is that biology demands strength, but the prevailing cultural ideology demands weakness. And when a man is caught between the two, if he chooses the ideology, he will find himself totally marginalized and unrespected in his actual private life.
Furthermore, Riker introduces data to suggest that this ideological war on nature is harming the very people it claims to liberate.
Meaning women.
Yes. He points to a highly cited 2009 paper by economists Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. It's titled The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness.
Oh, I remember reading about this. The data show that despite massive societal shifts over the last 40 years, in more economic freedom, more political power, the dismantling of traditional gender roles, women's self-reported happiness, has actually declined both absolutely and relative to men.
And Riker weaponizes this data. He uses it to argue that adopting an anti-male animus and fighting against natural complementary gender roles is a failed experiment.
Interesting.
By pathologizing the very men that women are biologically driven to partner with, the progressive ideology has manufactured a profound societal level misery.
Riker also leans heavily on evolutionary psychology regarding male aggression, doesn't he? Because the woke dictionary treats male aggression as a social construct, like an arbitrary learned behavior invented by the patriarchy.
Right, and Riker calls that notion absolute scientific fraud. He points out that male testosterone-driven competition, risk-taking, physical aggression, and fierce in-group loyalty are not social constructs. They are evolutionary anchors.
Right.
These are hard-won survival adaptations forged over 300,000 years of kin defense, tribal warfare, and environmental mastery.
The male biological operating system was basically designed to confront danger and impose order on chaos. And Riker argues that trying to legislate or shame that operating system out of existence with a new HR dictionary is not just arrogant, but practically suicidal for a civilization.
Which brings us to a massive structural question.
Okay, let's hear it.
If Riker's assertions are correct, that these progressive theories contradict basic evolutionary biology, cross-cultural data, and psychological reality, how did this ideological virus manage to conquer the very academic institutions that were built to pursue objective truth?
Right. We've established that the theories existed, but how did they become institutional law? This takes us right into the mechanics of what Riker calls academic counterfeiting and institutional capture.
Yes. Universities used to be the immune system of a society's intellect, filtering out bad ideas through rigorous peer review and empirical testing. Riker argues that this immune system has been entirely compromised.
Completely shut down.
He claims that modern universities, specifically via women's, gender, and grievance studies departments, operate as ideological forgery rings.
It's essentially an intellectual money laundering scheme.
That is the exact mechanism. You start with raw, subjective, highly politicized anti-male resentment. You take that resentment, feed it into the academic washing machine, dress it up in Derrida's impenetrable jargon, and pass it through a compromised peer review process. When it comes out the other side, it has been transformed into peer-reviewed scientific literature.
And once it has that academic stamp of approval, it can be exported to corporate America as unassailable fact. But wait, how do these departments protect this process from legitimate scientific scrutiny? Like, why don't biologists or statisticians just walk over to the sociology department and debunk the theories?
Because of a philosophical force field Riker identifies called standpoint epistemology.
Standpoint epistemology. Okay.
This is arguably the most dangerous trapdoor in the entire academic architecture. Standpoint epistemology dictates that a person's ability to possess knowledge is entirely dependent on their social position within a hierarchy of oppression.
So truth is no longer an objective reality out in the world. Truth is determined by the identity of the person speaking.
Exactly. In the intersectional feminist framework that Riker is critiquing, this means that if you are a man, specifically a heterosexual white man, your lived experience, your logical deductions, and your empirical data are all inherently invalid.
Because you're the oppressor.
Because you represent the oppressor class. Your epistemology is supposedly blinded by your privilege.
Unbelievable. By rigging the rules of engagement this way, they make their ideology completely unfalsifiable. It's an airtight feedback loop.
It really is.
If a man presents data proving biological differences, the data isn't refuted. The man is simply accused of using white male math or manifesting his oppressive power to silence marginalized voices. The system survives because academic insiders only cite each other's delusions and aggressively exile anyone who demands proof.
But Riker knows that making these claims requires receipts. He has to prove that the academic standards in these fields are genuinely as bankrupt as he alleges.
And does he?
Oh, he does. To do this, he details two massive, highly embarrassing historical hoaxes that completely shattered the credibility of the peer review process in grievance studies.
The first one he brings up is the legendary Alan Sokal affair from 1996. Sokal was a respected physics professor at NYU, right?
Yes, a real physicist.
He noticed that postmodern cultural studies departments were using physics terminology incorrectly to justify their political theories. So he decided to test the system.
And it was hilarious. Sokal wrote a paper titled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity.
Which means nothing.
The paper was absolute, deliberate gibberish. It argued that quantum gravity was not a physical reality, but merely a social and linguistic construct.
He submitted this nonsense to a leading left-wing cultural studies journal called Social Text. And what did the esteemed peer reviewers do? Because the paper flattered their postmodern feminist ideologies and used all the correct academic buzzwords, they published it.
They published literal nonsense without consulting a single physicist to verify the math.
Wow.
Riker uses the Sokal hoax to demonstrate that these institutions do not care about objective truth, they only care about ideological compliance. But as devastating as 1996 was, Riker argues that the problem only accelerated.
It got worse.
Much worse. He then details the staggering grievance studies affair executed in 2018 by Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose.
Oh man, this operation was on another level entirely. These three academics spent a year writing intentionally absurd, methodologically flawed, fake papers and submitting them to the absolute top-tier peer-reviewed journals in gender and cultural studies.
They submitted a paper claiming that dog parks were spaces of canine rape culture and systemic oppression.
And it was accepted.
It was accepted. But the terrifying climax of their operation, the example Riker highlights as the ultimate proof of institutional rot, involved Adolf Hitler.
Yes. They literally took a chapter from Hitler's Mein Kampf. They completely rewrote the text, swapping out the word Jews for men and updating the phrasing with modern feminist buzzwords. They submitted it under the title, Our Struggle is My Struggle.
And the prominent feminist journal Ophelia not only accepted the paper, they praised it for its scholarly brilliance and its profound understanding of patriarchal dynamics.
That is just insane.
For Riker, this is the definitive smoking gun. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the peer review process in these departments requires zero scientific rigor. It only requires a sufficiently rabid, theoretically justified hatred of men.
Riker also provides historical context to show that this ideological purity testing has been happening since the very dawn of the modern feminist movement. He brings up the heartbreaking case of Aaron Pizzi.
Yes, Aaron Pizzi is a vital historical anchor for his thesis. In 1971, Pizzi opened the very first domestic violence shelter in the modern world, located in the UK.
So she was on the front lines.
She was a true pioneer who actually did the grueling on-the-ground work to protect abused women.
But her experience running the shelter led her to an empirical truth that the emerging Marxist feminist establishment could not tolerate.
What did she find?
Pizzi noticed that many of the women coming to her shelter were just as violently aggressive as the men they were fleeing. She concluded, based on her direct lived experience, that domestic violence is often reciprocal, intergenerational, and not exclusively a mechanism of patriarchal control.
And the moment she published those findings, the feminist establishment turned on her with staggering ferocity. Riker notes that Pizzi was subjected to death threats, boycotts, and bomb scares.
Horrible.
She was ultimately exiled from the very movement and the very shelter she founded. Why? Because her objective reality contradicted the necessary political narrative that men are the sole oppressors. Riker uses Pizzi to prove that this institutional capture has prioritized Marxist ideology over empirical truth for over 50 years.
So we've thoroughly established the capture of the university. The theories are laundered, the peer review is fake, and the truth tellers are exiled. But theories in a faculty lounge don't cost a regular guy his livelihood.
No, they don't.
For that to happen, this ideology had to breach the corporate walls. How did it jump from the university into the boardroom?
That transmission is exactly what Riker tackles when he explores the concept of corporate castration and the massive diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI industry.
The DEI industry.
Yes. He explains that eventually, these highly radicalized, otherwise unemployable gender zealots graduated. They crawled out of their campus safe spaces and sought employment.
And they found their perfect Trojan horse in human resources departments.
Precisely. Riker does not mince words regarding the DEI industry, which is now a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise. He explicitly categorizes it as an institutional protection racket.
Literally like a mafia shakedown.
Exactly like a shakedown. Diversity consultants and sensitivity trainers sweep into a corporation. They actively manufacture outrage by pathologizing standard, healthy masculine behavior like direct communication, meritocratic competition, and urgency.
And then they sell the solution.
Once they have convinced the corporation that it is deeply infected with unconscious bias and systemic racism, they conveniently charge the company millions of dollars for the cure.
And the underlying economic theory Riker proposes to explain the mechanics of this racket is brilliant in its dark cynicism. He calls it grievance arbitrage.
It's a fascinating concept.
In financial markets, arbitrage is the simultaneous buying and selling of an asset to profit from an imbalance in the price. Riker applies this to victimhood.
Grievance arbitrage is the Marxist commodification of victimhood. Riker maps out the economic incentives here. We have created a progressive free market of misery. In this system, hypersensitive individuals are actively incentivized to hunt for or entirely fabricate microaggressions.
Because they can literally trade those grievances for tangible assets. I mean, if an employee claims to be the victim of a microaggression, they immediately gain social capital.
Yeah.
The HR department gains justification to expand its budget and authority, and the corporation pays out settlements or promotes the victim to avoid bad PR.
But wealth and status must be extracted from somewhere. Riker argues this creates a literal microaggression tax levied against competent, hardworking men.
A tax on competence.
Every time someone invents a linguistic slight, it results in a tangible withdrawal of capital, status, or career advancement from a man who actually earned it through merit. Riker claims this grievance economy is a weapon utilized by mediocre people who cannot compete on a level meritocratic playing field.
So they use the system to level it.
They use HR to penalize natural male hierarchy and elevate their own incompetence.
Let's role play the actual mechanics of how this looks in the corporate environment, because the trap Riker describes is terrifying. Say a man is pulled into an HR meeting for a mandatory unconscious bias training session. The premise of the training is that he's inherently biased, even if he doesn't know it. How does he defend himself against this subconscious crime?
He cannot, and that is the genius or the sheer malice of the system. Riker explains that unconscious bias training operates entirely on Kafka trap mechanics.
Named after Franz Kafka's nightmarish novel, The Trial.
Yes, let's walk through the Kafka trap. The HR commissar sits across from our hypothetical man and says, "Your communication style exhibits unconscious bias."
And the man replies, "No, it doesn't. I treat everyone equally and evaluate them strictly on their work output."
And the HR commissar smiles and notes in his file that his defensiveness is absolute proof of his deeply ingrained, unexamined bias. The trap dictates that a denial of guilt is the ultimate proof of guilt.
So if he admits to the bias, he is guilty and must submit to re-education and get a strike on his record. If he denies the bias, he is guilty of being blinded by his privilege, which is even worse.
Yeah.
He literally cannot win.
No.
The rules of engagement are designed to ensure continuous guilt and forced submission.
There is no escape through logic or debate. And Riker highlights a highly publicized real-world case study to prove just how lethal this environment is to male competence.
James Damore.
Yes, the execution of James Damore at Google in 2017.
Damore was a senior software engineer at Google, right? And he attended one of these mandatory diversity programs, which claimed that the gender disparity in tech was entirely due to systemic sexism. Damore, being an engineer who valued data, wrote an internal memo in response.
And what did that memo actually say? Did it contain hateful rhetoric? No.
Not at all.
Damore simply summarized mainstream, peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology and personality trait research. He pointed out that cross-cultural data shows men and women, on average, have different distributions of interests and trait neuroticism.
Right.
Men tend to be more interested in things like coding and systems, and women tend to be more interested in people. Damore suggested that these biological differences might explain part of the gender gap in engineering, rather than assuming it was all due to malicious bias.
He used actual verified science. He tried to have a rational, data-driven conversation about human biology to improve the company's hiring practices.
And for the crime of applying the scientific method to feminist dogma, Google aggressively purged him. He was fired, and the media smeared him as a misogynist.
Unbelievable.
Damore committed heresy against the woke dictionary. For Riker, the Damore case is the ultimate proof that in the modern corporate landscape, stating objective biological facts is treated as a punishable, fireable offense. Truth is no longer a defense.
Wow. So, Riker paints a picture of an almost totally inescapable hostile architecture. Academia is thoroughly captured and laundering the ideology. Corporate HR is operating a protection racket that penalizes competence. The media provides the narrative air support, destroying anyone who steps out of line.
It's bleak.
So for the listener who recognizes this reality and agrees with Riker's diagnosis, what on earth is the survival manual? How does a man continue to live, work, and thrive in a system fundamentally rigged against his nature?
Well, Riker doesn't leave his readers in a state of despair. In the final sections of his book, he pivots from diagnosis to highly actionable, aggressive solutions.
Okay, good.
He calls his overarching strategy fortress masculinity.
And the first brick in that fortress is a concept he introduces called semantic sovereignty.
Yes, semantic sovereignty is a man's fundamental, unyielding right to define his own reality, his own intentions, and to aggressively reject the progressive buzzwords imposed upon him by hostile actors.
Meaning he refuses to play their word games.
Riker insists that a man must act as a sovereign psychological agent. You do not treat the HR dictionary as valid. You must view their vocabulary as an enemy signal designed specifically to dismantle your perception of reality.
So, practically speaking, when the attack comes, what is the tactical defense?
The primary defense protocol Riker outlines is the combination of the Socratic trap and the mirror and dismiss technique. And the absolute non-negotiable golden rule Riker gives men is this: you must never apologize for a fabricated linguistic crime.
Never apologize. Because in their framework, an apology isn't a polite way to smooth over a misunderstanding. An apology is an admission of guilt to an unfalsifiable thought crime.
Exactly. Apologizing to a woke mob or a diversity consultant is like putting blood in the water for sharks. It signals weakness and validates their authority over you.
So what do you do instead?
Instead, Riker says, when you are accused of a microaggression or unconscious bias, you utilize the Socratic trap. You look the accuser dead in the eye, remain completely calm, and relentlessly demand empirical, objective evidence for their subjective feelings.
You ask questions that force them to define their made-up terms using material reality. What specific action did I take? How exactly does that action violate the employee handbook? What is the objective metric for the harm you are claiming?
Yes, you induce severe cognitive dissonance in the accuser. They are used to men crumbling, apologizing, and begging for forgiveness.
Right.
By entirely rejecting their premise, refusing to accept their emotional state as your responsibility, and demanding hard facts, you strip them of their authority. Their power over you relies 100% on your willingness to feel shame and comply. If you deny them that compliance, the mechanism breaks.
It's like dealing with a toddler throwing a tantrum in the middle of a grocery store. If you try to negotiate with the toddler, if you try to use logic to calm the screaming, you are validating the tantrum as a legitimate form of communication. You lose.
That's a great way to put it.
Riker is saying you don't negotiate. You simply refuse to acknowledge the hysteria. You mirror their absurdity back to them, and then you dismiss it.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the strategy. You treat the woke dictionary with the exact same detached contempt you would a toddler's meltdown.
But, I can hear the listener asking, how does a man sustain this without being utterly destroyed by the mob? We just discussed James Damore losing his career at Google. It is incredibly easy to sit here and say, never apologize, demand facts, but the institutional consequences, loss of income, social ostracization, they're very real.
And Riker intimately understands that risk, which is why he points to specific historical and cultural models of resistance to prove that frame fortification is not only possible, but it is the only way to survive. He leans heavily on the watershed moment of Dr. Jordan Peterson in 2016.
The Canadian Bill C-16 controversy.
Yeah.
This was the moment that really exposed the linguistic war to the mainstream.
Exactly. The Canadian government introduced Bill C-16, which would theoretically add gender identity to the Human Rights Code, effectively creating a legal mandate for compelled speech regarding synthetic manufactured pronouns.
Yeah.
Peterson, then a relatively unknown psychology professor, publicly drew a line in the sand and stated he would simply refuse to comply with compelled speech.
He recognized the dictionary attack for what it
Yeah.
was.
Riker views Peterson's stand as an absolute masterclass in semantic sovereignty. Peterson proved that when a man entirely refuses to adopt his opponent's linguistic frame, he neutralizes their power.
Wow.
Peterson survived a full-spectrum, multi-year media and institutional assault because he refused to grant his attackers the linguistic authority they demanded. He exposed the authoritarian roots of their ideology by simply saying, "No, I will not use your words."
But Riker knows that not everyone has the platform of a Jordan Peterson. For the everyday man building his fortress, Riker reaches back much further than 2016. He prescribes a deep immersion into ancient philosophy.
He specifically points to Stoicism. He highlights the works of Epictetus, a philosopher who was actually born a slave and later won his freedom. In his Enchiridion, written around 125 AD, Epictetus outlines the core doctrine of Stoicism, the absolute ruthless division between what is in your control and what is not.
And Riker applies this directly to the modern corporate and cultural battlefield.
He does. Look, you cannot control the hysterical, ever-changing vocabulary of a gender studies graduate who somehow ended up in your HR department. You cannot control the media narrative. But you have absolute control over your internal psychological state.
Frame fortification.
Yes, you control your detachment. Frame fortification requires ruthless psychological sovereignty, the ability to look at an institution telling you that you are inherently evil and simply shrug it off as the noise of a dying system.
Riker pairs that ancient detached stoicism with raw physical American ambition. He quotes Theodore Roosevelt to obliterate the progressive critique of male ambition.
Ah, yes. He uses Roosevelt's famous 1910 Man in the Arena speech delivered at the Sorbonne. Roosevelt praised the man whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, the man who actually strives to build, to conquer, and to impose order on the world.
Riker contrasts that physical, tangible, bloody achievement with the bitter progressive critic who sits safely in an air-conditioned academic office, counting microaggressions and deconstructing the achievements of better men.
It's a stark contrast.
Riker argues that the physical world, the bridges built, the code written, the families protected, matters infinitely more than the delicate, easily bruised feelings of the critics.
Which leads directly to Riker's final and perhaps most radical tactical solution for his readers: economic rebellion.
Because at the end of the day, abstract psychological defenses and quoting Stoic philosophy aren't enough when Marxist ideologues control the paycheck that feeds your family. Riker's ultimate strategic advice is to starve the beast.
Yes, economic sovereignty is the final wall of the fortress. Riker advises highly competent men to entirely stop seeking validation from and stop handing their labor over to institutions that view their biology as a disease.
How does a man actually execute that in the modern economy, though?
By strategically withdrawing. Riker tells his readers to stop taking on massive debt to spend 4 years at universities that openly despise them. Instead, pursue high-paying physical trades, welding, electrical, plumbing.
Real skills.
Learn highly technical skills that cannot be faked. Start a business. Engage in entrepreneurship. Utilize decentralized digital networks and cryptocurrencies to build wealth that is completely immune to the woke banking establishment.
He is advocating for the creation of a parallel economy. If you build power, capital, and wealth outside the reach of the corporate DEI racket, you become completely untouchable. You are no longer reliant on the HR commissar for your survival.
Precisely. To synthesize Conrad Riker's ultimate overarching message throughout this incredibly dense text, traditional masculinity is not a toxic disease waiting for a progressive cure.
It's the opposite.
It is the biological imperative. It is the foundational pillar of human survival that physically built the modern world, and men must unapologetically, fiercely reclaim it.
It is a call for a total reclamation of dominance through an unyielding commitment to objective truth.
That is the structural core of microaggression myths.
All right, well, we are going to wrap up this extensive breakdown here. We have covered a massive amount of highly charged, provocative ground today, from Derrida and the birth of the dictionary attack, through the Kafka traps of modern HR, all the way to the strategies of semantic sovereignty and economic rebellion.
We really covered a lot.
We did, and I want to remind you, the listener, that understanding these source texts is absolutely vital. Regardless of whether you enthusiastically agree with every single word Conrad Riker wrote, or whether you vehemently disagree with his entire premise, You must understand the arguments shaping the modern cultural landscape.
You cannot navigate or survive a cultural war without deeply understanding the philosophies and the tactics being deployed by all sides.
Exactly. So, for those of you who want to dive into the raw source material for yourselves and study the mechanics we've discussed today, we highly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the ebook, Microaggression Myths, Surviving Feminist Linguistic Attacks.
It is a text that demands careful analytical reading.
And if you want to follow the author directly and read more of his ongoing analysis, you can find Conrad Riker over at his Substack, which is at Conrad Riker. Once again, before we sign off, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these ultra-long, incisive deep dives.
We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us for this one.
Now, as always, we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought. Something provocative to mull over on your own that builds on what we've discussed today. You brought up Riker's concept of economic rebellion at the very end. The idea of competent men deliberately withdrawing from the system to build their own fortresses.
I did, and it raises a profound, almost existential question when we consider the logical endpoint of Riker's philosophy.
Yep.
If Riker's ultimate solution is for the most highly competent, driven, and capable men to entirely withdraw their labor, their capital, their engineering skills, and their participation from mainstream corporate and academic institutions...
What happens next?
Exactly. What happens to the global economic and physical infrastructure of a society when the very people who actually build and maintain it simply walk away?